What's up, guys? So the title, right over there, RPE versus VBT. So rating of perceived exertion versus velocity-based training. I figured I should define them and then kind of compare them and then kind of go from there. So RPE just means kind of how hard do you think that set was, and there's different kind of charts that you can look at. A lot of times people kind of compare RPE with RIR, reps in reserve, and ideally they're very similar, but then it kind of falls apart when it's like, okay, how hard that felt versus how many more reps do you think you could have had. So that's its own little debate, but basically you can do a set and just be like, yeah, I like to use I think it's Mike Tertiar's guide from Reactive Training Systems. Basically he's just like, okay, could you have done maybe one more solid rep and then possibly think about another one that might be like an 8.5 or 9 RPE. I like his scale a lot more, but the basis comes back from earlier research and kind of the strength and conditioning field, not just powerlifting itself. VBT, velocity based training, essentially it follows your bar path. It doesn't necessarily measure, it can measure kind of the line it takes, but it essentially is point A to point B and how fast did it get from point A to point B. And they've done a ton of research on that kind of monitoring load, and so how fast the load was, but the idea is now we have to add intent into it as well. So how hard you do each set, because some people can just lackadaisically do a set, that kind of throws off the velocity loading, or at least the monitoring of it. What some people don't know, or what a lot of people don't know, it seems, that RPE actually was based on a velocity-based situation. So they compared the velocity with what the athlete rated it as, and essentially the gold standard of kind of load monitoring comes from velocity-based training, and then they just kind of added a subjective rating to it, and that's kind of where RPE came from. And it's just much easier to use an RPE scale versus velocity-based training. There's a bunch of new things coming out now, and people are kind of like, oh, VBT is awesome, blah blah blah, but you need this $300 or $500 bar sensei thing or whatever the brands are, which they're super accurate. It's kind of hard to beat the accuracy, I guess you could say, of them. Reliability is super high as well, but it's super expensive, and not everybody can afford to do that. So then people kind of go RPE, but now it's like, how do you base your RPE at? Because ideally, if your goal is to work up to a heavy single, what defines heavy, right? And then if you're doing a triple, well, what's a heavy triple like? Because a triple is still a very different loading scheme, and kind of, I guess, how much effort you have to put into it in over a period of time versus one single effort. And then you have your single, so it's still very different, and it's hard to kind of compare what you should be doing, what you should feel, and I like to say feelings can be liars too, because the amount of times I've had it, and a lot of times some athletes and some of my other lifters out there, we'll see the video and you're like, that did not feel that easy, because they'll just fly. And that is where I like to have VBT come in. And there's apps out there now that are actually pretty reliable. Accuracy is within 0.25 and 2%. But the idea with reliability, it's still consistent results. So it's it might not be as accurate as the bar sensor or whatever that you're using, if you've used one of those before, but it's still reliable, which you can still use to kind of track and monitor, and still use it as a very solid tool. And the apps are pretty inexpensive comparative to $2 versus $300, $400, $500. So my big thing, and I've been kind of toying with it, is kind of with some of my athletes, and not so much me myself, just because me and my coach haven't really had that discussion yet, but just from past things, I've used it in the clinic before, and I really like when you add intent, because that's the goal, is you want to get the bar up, right? So why not just have 100% into each rep, even though that might not be what's required from you, right? You still want to have controls within reason too, but with VBT, kind of helps take the guesswork out. Okay, I was still trying to maximally load this, and I slowed down that much slower compared to my sets at 225 versus 245 or whatever. And there's kind of loading schemes too, or zones that they kind of monitor. So if you're at this certain meters per second, you're working speed strength, or a little faster, you're working strength speed, or stuff like that. And then they compare it to isometric, where the bar is actually not going anywhere in intent from there. So you guys are going to probably start seeing a lot more of my, I guess, my input or my thought process on VBT. Kind of the next wave of my content's gonna kind of lightly be focused on that, just to give some more information out there, just because I think it's super interesting and super useful, and I think it's a lot more accessible now. Instead of just saying, what the hell was that RPE? Be like, okay, I still had max intent on that lift and it did slow down. Maybe I need to back off and stay within this zone, or this rep speed zone. And that can help even dial in, load management even farther. Of course, load management only has a certain amount of influence on performance and injury prevention, or injury risk reduction, I should say. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than what subjective ratings we have, like RPE and reps in reserve and stuff like that. So just thought I'd get on here, kind of explain that a little bit, why I'm a little bit more obsessed with that kind of stuff, and then we'll kind of go from there. So thanks for my TED Talk.